Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's first of a three-part learning journey enabling innovation with application security. So my name is Sean Kelly, and I'm an application security expert here at GitHub, and I'll be your host for these sessions. I'm dialing in from Boston today, so let us know where you're from in the chat section. Also joining me today is Kevin Olwell. Kevin is one of our principal solutions engineers here at GitHub, and he'll be walking us through the majority of today's presentation. Also joining us is our special guest, Andrew Moose McCoy, one of our field security architects here at GitHub. So, hey, say hello, gentlemen.
Hey, everyone. Great to see you.
Good to be here.
Awesome. So over the next 3 Tuesdays, we'll be covering the following topics. For today, we'll talk about why are we still shipping applications with security issues. And next Tuesday, we'll be discussing improving application security with an end-to-end approach. And the following Tuesday, we'll discuss overcoming challenges with developer-first application security. So for today's meeting, we'll be using the Chatham House rules, which means anyone who comes to a meeting is free to use the information from the discussion, but is not allowed to reveal who made any particular comments. It's basically designed to increase openness of discussion. So with that, let's get started with part 1. Why are we still shipping applications with security issues? So the top 4 issues that we hear are as follows. Number 1, maturity, right? A lot of organizations today are still in the process of switching from DevOps to DevSecOps. Although DevOps has been around for a while, DevOps itself it's constantly evolving. Now that security is being introduced, it's taking even longer to get to a desired maturity level with DevSecOps. Tooling and capabilities. Most application security tools require manual configuration, and they take a long time to produce results. A lot of these tools also can't distinguish between a vulnerability that is a real exposure versus a potential exposure. So they alert on all of them. As a result, your developers waste precious time dealing with false positives, and software innovation is often slowed down. And because of all of the above, you end up with various shortcomings. You end up with, friction a lot of times between security, development, and operations. You end up with longer times to remediate. Remediation is often overlooked or done later in the life cycle, which results in a higher cost to remediate. I can go on and on about this, but I'd like to hear your thoughts. We'd like to hear from you. Would you agree or disagree with what I just mentioned? Did I miss anything? I'm pretty sure I have. Please feel free to comment. And with that, I'd like to pass things over to Kevin and Moose to go into more detail. And if time permits, we can walk you through a demo and show you how GitHub Advanced Security is helping organizations with this issue.
All right, Mr. Sean, thank you. Cool, you stopped sharing. I'll go ahead and share my screen. So we do have the chat open on the side as well. So as folks are filing in, I know we were presenting both in LinkedIn and live on this Goldcast. But if you would just go ahead into that public channel, drop some commentary in there in terms of where you are in your own AppSec journey. I think we'd love to have that context as we kind of push content your way. We can feed off that and use it as part of the discussion. And I think the intention of today was not just to, pipe content your way, but also to, let's go ahead and share the screen here, but also to, pull you up on stage and have a discussion, an active discussion about where you are in your AppSec journey and some of the things that you've learned in your own practice that we can, that we can all take away as nuggets of wisdom. I think you'll hear that come up time and again in the content that we share with you. So I think the first thing that I'm going to go ahead and talk through is the state of security today. And actually, why don't I go ahead and do this? I have my little cheat sheet here to ensure that I'm making the best use of your time as well. There we go. Cool. All right. So yeah, so we're going to go ahead and talk through some of the data from the latest security reports that we've gotten from an aggregation across the industry of findings from folks like Veracode and Verizon and IBM and GitHub's own security research team. So I'm going to try to empower you with some data so that you can have informed conversations internally and externally with your customers and internal stakeholders. Then we're going to frame the problem of AppSec around remediation instead of around tooling. And I think my intention here as the person who kind of put a lot of this content together was to make it less about, GitHub's native tooling and more about some of the philosophy driving, what we're developing in terms of our tooling, and also what we're learning from our customers, folks like you who are rolling out these programs at scale. And a lot of that has to do with developer empowerment. So we'll talk about that. And we also have a practical DevSecOps guide, some steps, if you will, that you can take away and maybe use in your own practice. And I think a lot of the folks on the call here are folks that we work with regularly in our own kind of day-to-day engagements from GitHub back to your own, security org. And so some of this may look familiar to you. Some of this may actually have been sourced from you. And so if that's the case, then thank you. It's great to pull insight from the community and use that so that everyone is more secure, and we're just kind of raising the bar, if you will. So again, let's talk a little bit about some data-driven insight. Hopefully you can walk away with a few pieces of information that will empower your internal conversations, right? And so I think there's a lot that can be said for the latest breach report. The average data breach is costly. We're looking at something like a $4 million cost of the average breach. If you're in financial services, if you're in insurance, healthcare, if you're a large technology company or a data-driven organization, it's highly probable that this is the actual cost of a breach would be a multiple of 4 million. And so this is a low estimate, but it's the type of number that you can take back internally inside your own org as you're having conversations with the business stakeholders to justify increased resourcing, right? And so that's why I want to arm you with what the cost of doing nothing is. And when you start to look at the profile of folks who are actually exploiting your organization's vulnerabilities, they're financially motivated. It's pretty simple, right? And if you assume that they're taking away something like 25% of what the total cost of that breach was, there's something like $1 million on the line, and a multiple of that if you're a larger organization. And so how can we build our defenses so strong that they are a deterrent to these bad actors who are exploiting us for financial gain? We want to make that so costly from a technological and labor-intensive perspective that folks don't target our organization to be exploited. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to help us to do that. And I want to include something early on about the power of stolen credentials. We see a lot of exploits happening. We talk about a low-hanging fruit for bad actors. Well, if they get their hands on your tokens and credentials for your service providers, something like a public cloud provider, MailChimp, Datadog, Twilio, whatever it happens to be, it's a really simple way for them to exploit you. And we do something natively. We have our own token scanning tool that's really awesome. You just enable it at the organization level, and it looks for tokens across the entire org, right? Just kind of like immediately delivering value back to you as someone who's implementing an AppSec program. And so that's something I always encourage folks. It's a low-hanging fruit for enablement, and it has a lot of value. Now, a really common attack vector, just one more comment on stolen credentials, is also to see tokens leak through CI logs. Something I liked about Actions when it was delivered early on is that we automatically redact secrets from the build logs. And so we basically go in there and asterisk out any unintentional printing of your tokens. And so that's really helpful. A lot of times we see folks, leaking through their Jenkins build. If someone gets access to your environment, they'll go ahead and look at your logs and they'll be able to exploit you through that. And I think here, Mr. Moose.
Yeah, I just want to add some context for you, Kevin. That's such a great analogy or great point, and I want to draw an analogy to if you even think about in the 80s and 90s, when credit cards were kind of becoming prevalent everywhere as a means of spending. They used to print the 16-digit credit card and all the information on the receipt and stuff. So other industries have gone through this level of security validation, and that's hitting it spot on. Is really how can we not just obfuscate them? I hate that word, but as well as just really make the whole system as hygienic and user friendly as possible, and not allow folks to be a target of opportunity.
For sure. And it's all about not being a target of opportunity. These folks, they're financially motivated, and if it's a low-hanging fruit, they're going to exploit you, as you have experienced and know. And this 56% number, I'd hold on to that. I think it's speaking to the broader problem across the industry, which is a remediation problem in terms of how long it takes for us to detect vulnerabilities initially, and then how long it actually takes us to ship a patch for that vulnerability. And so narrowing the funnel, if you will, from just broad scope, state of the industry, what a typical exploit looks like, to typical application security challenges. And the reason it's so important to talk about this and frame it in our conversation is because 70% of breaches happen via your web applications. And there's a reason we see, reading right to left here, there's a reason we see an increase in security issues coming from your web apps. And I know Sean has commentary around this in terms of the journey that someone like GE has gone through. I like to talk a lot about a company that I worked with in the past, Domino's, who, they're a technology company who happen to deliver food. They happen to be in the food business, the pizza business. And as we all become technology companies, and as the attack surface expands based on the number of apps we're developing and delivering expands, you can also expect a incremental increase in the number of vulnerabilities that make their way into your apps. And we'll see that correlation in a pretty graph later on, but I thought it was worthwhile to call out. And so the last thing that I'll mention here is, the probability that your apps actually have a vulnerability. And this comes up all the time in, different evaluations we're doing, and if we're working to implement CodeQL, our native security tooling, in an application pipeline. So what's the probability we're actually going to find something interesting inside that app? And so the most applications have at least one security flaw. And I think it would be important for us to walk away with an understanding of the nature of that security flaw. And so from this same state of security report from Veracode that we pulled this stat from, they also called out that most of those vulnerabilities, it was something like 65% were either OWASP top 10 or SANS top 25 type vulnerabilities. And 25% of those were critical vulnerabilities. And so we do have a pretty good understanding of where we should be focusing our energy as we look to implement these AppSec tools, right? And so, yeah, there shouldn't be too many secrets out there in terms of like the types of vulnerabilities that are inside our applications, whether or not our applications are vulnerable. I think we should all err on the side of, yes, we have a vulnerability in our app, and when it gets there, it's likely to stay there for an extended period of time. And so looking at the center here, there's this SAST fix rate. So there's over a 90-day period, there's a 45% chance that your developers or your AppSec engineers are actually going to remediate a vulnerability that's made its way into your production application. And so when we have conversations with folks who are implementing AppSec tools, we often kind of reframe the conversation from, instead of a conversation about how effective the SAST tool itself is, right? Reframing the production of that haystack and finding the needle. It comes down to the remediation conversation. So, hey, we found this vulnerability in your app. How do we empower your developers to remediate that, or we found this vulnerability, how do we empower your developers to remediate that vulnerability within a reasonable time frame? So it doesn't sit out there in a customer-facing application for an extended period of time, which will increase the probability that you're being exploited. And I thought this stat definitely stood out to me, that flaws remain open after a year and a half, a quarter of the time. And it's less common that you would think that folks have SaaS tooling integrated in their pipelines. And so with a forward-looking organization, a forward-looking dev team rather, you might find that SaaS tools have been integrated there, and every time, for example, a developer opens a pull request, you run a SaaS scan and produce some findings based on that. But a lot of times that's not happening. A lot of times, we're still in that situation where development teams are only performing a scan just before the application makes its way into production. And we'll talk later about why that's a costly approach and why we should be doing security analysis as early as the design stage of our SDLC. So Mr. Moose, I'll call you to the stage again. And you want to add any color there?
I mean, I think that 36% stat hits it right on the head. I just did a software supply chain learning journey for EMEA, and I think I'll be doing it throughout the rest of this quarter with you and Sean. But really, that's spot on the head. I mean, there's tools and ways out there to eliminate and automate that away, make it an afterthought. So really, table stakes for me is making sure that you have the ability to automate away version updates. Not even thinking about security. Don't even let yourself use 3-4 year old components. There's potential for unknown security issues in there, bugs, who knows? Don't use old stale components and automate that open source hygiene away. And that allows you to then focus more so on the SAST issues and things that really are a top priority in growing the maturity of your DevSecOps operation.
Totally. It's all about the automation aspect. It's all about the scalability, right? Because we know that more code equals more technical debt and exposure, right? As your developers continue to deliver more lines of code, there is a correlation in the number of security issues that are getting introduced back into your applications. And the problem with this is the scale at which it's happening. And we go and we talk to these AppSec teams, folks like you, across these different organizations that have adopted GitHub and GitHub Advanced Security. And one of the primary problems is they have a team of like 5 to 10 security engineers supporting thousands of developers, right? And that's something that we see not just in the enterprise space, but in the broader, open source community. Moose, I hear you dial in here. Any comment there?
No, I mean, this is spot on. If existing approaches were working, these numbers wouldn't be rising and staying as closely related, especially with the lines of code continuing to increase, the security threats introduced, and then the big one that jumps out to me there is the commits mentioning vulnerabilities. That's just, a symbol that open source maintainers aren't using the National Vulnerability Database, that maybe they don't know, maybe they don't have the time. Maybe they're a college student that created an open source project, just took off like a rocket ship. And that's where, our community-driven advisories and security advisories have really alleviated a lot of that and is really working to change that tide and make open source vulnerability information part of the natural piece of open source governance and open source as a whole.
And Kevin, I just wanted to say one thing about this slide. So this slide actually kind of, speaks to, all of those numbers that you and stats you showed earlier, right? All companies are becoming software companies these days. You mentioned Domino's Pizza. I always think about GE. So if you think about GE as an organization, you think jet turbines, appliances, and things like that. But a company like GE is running thousands and thousands of applications today to run/manage the business as well as those components. So and these those stats that you see right there really speak to it. Just how the amount of source code being brought into organizations is growing so much. So I did want to add that part.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that, Mr. Sean. Yeah, I think it's a great example. GE, Domino's, these every organization becoming this technology company. And so all these problems apply kind of horizontally, right? And so this is a phenomenon that we've noticed, again, as we go and talk with these different AppSec teams. And if we start reading right to left here, there is a massive disparity between the number of developers inside your organization and the number of security engineers that are working to remediate vulnerabilities as they're being introduced back into your applications. And so when you start to look at an answer to the question of, well, why am I not seeing vulnerabilities remediated within a reasonable timeline? We'll talk about that later, but part of it is because you have this massively constrained team that's trying to support this number of engineers. And to Moose's comment earlier, how can we take any steps towards leveling the playing field? And so obviously looking to the left here, we want to empower your developers to also be the stakeholders of the security of the applications you're delivering, right? And so if we empower the developers, all of a sudden the stats that we're seeing on the right side here don't apply, because now everybody is responsible for the security of the apps that are being delivered. And by doing that, by empowering those developers and remediating vulnerabilities early on in the development process, we significantly reduce the cost of vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities as a whole for our organization. And so they're not making their way into production where they're extremely costly. And so maybe what I'll do for a moment here is pause the content, pushing towards you, and actually pull the audience. I'd love for folks who are joining us here to share some commentary from your own experiences. This session is supposed to be a little bit less formal, a little bit more of like collaborative with you. And so if you're open to it, I'd love to pull you all on stage for a moment to share something, maybe like a fun fact about yourself that no one else knows, and what organization you belong to, and then what your biggest AppSec challenge is today in rolling out your program. So again, I'd love to hear some comments, and we can represent those comments we're seeing on LinkedIn best that we can here together. If you're not comfortable jumping on stage, or if you want to raise your hand on Goldcast, we'll pull you up and make you part of that conversation. So some folks are asking if the audio is working, and then some folks are also commenting on things like, I see Mr. Reza there. Good morning from Atlanta. I see some folks talking about things like pushback from devs on performing scans. And so I'd love to, hey James, I'd love to shift the conversation in a moment about practical DevSecOps. And that just in my world means what are the steps you can take to roll out a program in a way that's not intrusive to your developer workflows. And so that's really the area we're gonna spend the bulk of our conversation on. So it's definitely common that developers are saying, hey, I appreciate what it is that you're doing in security, but my responsibility is to deliver features. And so you do your thing and I'm gonna do mine, right? And they kind of push us to the side. So that's something that's totally common. And so we see Robert with some commentary on LinkedIn talking about third-party malicious content and vulnerabilities getting pulled in via open source repos such as PyPy. I can comment on this, Sean. Do you want to take this one? I'm thinking Dependabot. I'm thinking about what Moose was talking about earlier, which is, you're twice as likely within a 48-hour period to remediate a vulnerability that comes from open source if you have Dependabot enabled. Dependabot's free, okay? If you're a GitHub Enterprise customer, I would encourage you to consider going to the organization level as an admin in your GitHub Enterprise environment and enabling Dependabot. It will provide alerts for when you have vulnerabilities making their way into your applications from open source consumption. And it will also open pull requests automatically to remediate those for you. It's a super low hanging fruit, just like turning on secret scanning is if you have advanced security. And maybe Mr. Moose, I saw you come back on here. Any comments from your side?
No, I mean, you hit it spot on, and there's definitely some good commentary on the LinkedIn chat from John Hodgkins, John H. I'm sorry, I'm not going to butcher your name. Amazed that the PR policies and gates should not allow vulnerabilities to be committed into mainline branches developed for Git flow master and main for trunk. I mean, that's kind of table stakes. I think where we chat with organizations, Kevin, at the end of the day is really. There's always going to be an exception process in large organizations that we understand, but really that exception process being on the onus of the developer to prove the false positive, prove why you're not exploitable is kind of one of those big things that allows those gates to remain rigid. And really, they're not even. I don't even like to think of them as gates. Sometimes I think of them as like guardrails on the highway. And then the toll booths are going to be kind of those checkpoints that you're going through to make sure that maybe you're at the right speed limit or paying your toll, making sure you have the right security and or quality pieces through your application as well.
Well said. Beautiful. I saw some commentary come through from Paul Young, and I just wanted to call you out, Paul, because it sounds like you're a student in a university and you're shocked by the disparity between security researchers and developers. And I'd say if you're studying comp sci, it would be super helpful to have you also study InfoSec. The market's pretty hot for that right now. So welcome to the game, sir. So Jack's talking about mono repos, hundreds of thousands of applications run by different teams, complex use cases for implementing AppSec tools. Yeah, well, look, I think the way we pick this apart is, or in my experience is, your pipelines are often already tailored to accommodate your mono repo. And so if you have these services that are baked in, even though they're stored inside a single repository, chances are you're building these services from different directories with distinct pipelines. And so I would encourage you to explore maybe, integrating your AppSec tool, your SaaS tooling, at the pipeline level for each individual service inside that repo, for each individual piece of technology, and then maybe have that bubble up to some aggregate scan, some aggregate view of your application as a whole. And so, yeah, I would just echo your feedback that, Jack, that it's a complex use case. There's no like easy solution, no silver bullet I can hand you right now, but it's totally achievable. I see Mr. Reza talking about the challenges in large organizations. Security tools are vetted, procured by cyber, and the process for development teams scale slows them down. That makes a lot of sense. Actually, as a matter of fact, what I'd like to do, I see we have a lot of feedback flowing in here. So what I'm going to do is maybe like hand back to Sean and Moose to like respond to you on LinkedIn and through the chat here, if that's okay. And I want to continue to just push a little bit of content your way, because I think what we're going to talk through actually addresses a lot of like Reza, what you called out, Jack, a little bit of what you called out, and of course, James Zabinski, who's suggesting enabling dependent bot. So let me go ahead and start sharing my screen again. It's kind of wonky to do that. Go ahead,
Awesome,
Moose.
Kevin. While you do that, I do want to tee up. There's a really great question for you to kind of bite off on as you dig into it. Hello from New Jersey. So, I'm from Connecticut, but pork roll fan.
Okay.
Kevin's up there in Connecticut or Jersey. Hello. Any suggestions on how to start with older code bases with lots of issues? It usually ends up being some level of alert fatigue. I think that's a great way for you to kind of talk about the how CodeQL really gives you that out of the box precise level of queries.
Yeah, well, yeah, so I'm happy to talk about that. I think, yeah, well, you know, I think something that should be said is as these AppSec tools, as these SaaS tools get better, you know, inevitably they're going to become commoditized, right? CodeQL today for JavaScript, which is a highly supported language, produces something like an 80% true positive rate on your apps with the default query suite that you run on your initial scan. So we try to eliminate the noise we put in front of the developer by selecting a very accurate subset of queries to run initially. We're totally empathizing with the fact that, you know, that relationship between you, the security team, and the development team is like fundamental to having a successful program, right? And so we have a very high true positive rate. That's like the foundation of enabling this DevSecOps program, is to, when we deliver results, make sure they're high value, not just like point to the haystack and say, find the needle, but rather, hey, either this is a greatly condensed haystack, so like we're showing you significantly less alerts than maybe you're used to in a lower quality SaaS tool, but hopefully just picking out specifically those needles. And so I'm going to like orient us a little bit away from like that super broad conversation and hopefully narrow down on practical DevSecOps. So this should be a conversation about how you might actually practically roll out DevSecOps inside your own organization. And so I've kind of pulled insights from a lot of the folks that we meet with across GitHub. We're rolling out security programs, and hopefully this will be interesting for you. And one of the questions I had to ask myself was like, why is this so hard, right? Like, why is it so challenging to roll out a DevSecOps program? It's been around for a decade. Nobody's doing it super well. You know, the remediation rates are extremely low, even though spend on security tools is still really high. And so naturally, I think it comes down to that human problem, right? The problem is the people. The problem is people like me, right? Because my doctor recommends I eat 5 servings of vegetables a day, but I still start my day with a donut. And so the point is that it's really challenging for us to change our own behavior. Think about your own life. Think about some habit that you've tried to implement, such as like, I don't know, cutting down on the amount of television that you watch or eating a healthier diet, right? Whatever it happens to be, it's really hard to stick with that over an extended period of time. It's even more difficult if you have kids, especially teenagers, or people that you would like to influence to change their behavior, right? And so it's difficult to change our own, but it's nigh impossible to change the behavior of someone else. And fundamentally, that is what we are like working to do here, right? Is we're looking to, as the AppSec team, influence the behavior of our developer organization. And so that's a really difficult problem to solve, but it's not an impossible problem to solve. Ask these folks, right? And if you're from Google here, just kudos to you, right? Because it's a responsibility of the, you know, certain organizations to influence the behavior of people who interact with their platform. And the spend kind of demonstrates that folks are finding value in this. It's true that you can, in fact, influence behavior, maybe if you have various touch points over time. And so recently I posted on LinkedIn a thought that I had. I'm just kind of like, throwing it around in my own mind and sharing it with you is, so we're all working towards this idea of, changing our behavior over time, and folks like Google are doing it really well. Well, I'm trying to recall exactly what the thought was. I lost my train of thought there, but so yeah, why don't we do this? Let's move forward in talking about practical DevSecOps. I'll circle back there, and we'll talk a little bit about maybe the practices and tools inside the orgs that that as you're rolling out this program. So let's go ahead and do that. Any comments? Yeah.
Question that I was actually typing up a reply, but it might be better for you. This is a perfect kind of segue into it. Is what's the from the chat? What's the difference between DevOps and DevSecOps? So for me, it's really kind of DevOps. They're so overloaded terms and such hot buzzwords. To me, DevOps is really just about the initial automation and maturity. Oh my God, we cannot talk today, dude. This is maturation of your SDLC. From there, the SecOps comes as you embed security at different points at varying levels as you mature over time as well. It's not going to be we need to create all these gates and stop development. It's how can we create some information and then begin growing the team's skills in it over time. Yeah,
that's a great point. And so the thought I had to that's a good point. And just the thought that I wanted to share earlier was, for the folks who are thinking about the types of skills that they need to build up into their own orgs. In some cases, maybe that's like part InfoSec. Obviously, there's some development as the foundation, but also behavioral psychology, right? Like we want to influence the behavior of those teams that we're partnering with to roll out DevSecOps. And so, DevSecOps is certainly a subset of DevOps. And so if you're doing DevOps right, there's really no concept of DevSecOps because it is just included under that umbrella that your developers not only own the delivery of those applications and the health of those applications in production, but also they own the security of those applications in production. So that would be my perspective on the difference between DevOps and DevSecOps. And folks have been talking about that for a little while now. So let's talk, like, what can you practically do inside your own org to roll out a DevSecOps program? So systematic consultation is a common theme that we see for folks who have an AppSec team. Maybe it's just a handful of folks who are supporting a broader dev organization that they're trying to roll out and win mind share for this AppSec program. And so I'd encourage you to consider actually partnering with these teams at some point in their sprint cycle, meaning like bring one of your AppSec engineers from your team, sit down with the engineering folks, work with them to integrate this SaaS tool into their pipeline, work with them to integrate that SaaS tooling with your own reporting tool so you have insight going forward of the health of the applications, the remediation timelines, all those important metrics that you need to justify the resourcing and justify the effort from on the AppSec side of the house. And so systematic consultation is something I'd encourage you to consider. And something we've seen that folks have a lot of success with is rolling out a champions program inside their own orgs. And so maybe this is the type of person who has an organic interest inside the engineering org. You're probably already thinking of somebody who's like always excited to get involved with a new technology that's rolled out or a new practice that the organization's been implementing. And so that would be a great type of person to empower. So meet with them, provide some education sessions for them about your AppSec program, how to integrate your tooling, right? And so the engineers can feel comfortable going to them first before calling on your team. And it also helps you scale, right? Like when we look back at that disparity between the number of folks in your team and in the engineering organization, yes, we need automation, but a lot of times we also need people to meet with people to influence their behavior. So folks have organic interest, and send out, just a broadcast across the org. Is there anyone who wants to be involved in this program as you're looking to roll it out? And a little bit tongue in cheek here in terms of Venn diagrams, but what I think is really interesting is the initial question of like, okay, say tomorrow we want to roll out GitHub Advanced Security. Tomorrow we want to roll out some AppSec program. Where do we start, right? And so we've like really talked through some of the ways that you can build out that program. But something that I encourage you to focus on as you integrate your SaaS tooling specifically is the low-hanging fruit first, right? Let's get some quick wins under your belt. Let's demonstrate progress. And this way you'll be able to kind of re-energize your team and re-energize the organization toward your final goal. And so one of the ways you can do that is to focus on this intersection between your supported languages for your SaaS tooling. And so, for example, CodeQL supports out of the box with a very high true positive rate, JavaScript and Python. And so those are interpreted languages, right? And so that app would not need to be built to be scanned. And so the integration is more simple than something like compiled language, whether it's a Java app or a C# app, okay? And so focus on this low-hanging fruit where your tooling supports them very well. So JavaScript, great place to start your implementation. And so don't just look for all the JavaScript apps across your company, right? I'm sure there are thousands or tens of thousands, but also look at who it would make sense to engage with, right? In terms of where that team is on the adoption curve. Are they innovators? Are they early adopters? If yes, and they're using a well-supported language or framework with your SaaS tooling, maybe that's a great place for you to start, right? So here's a team that would be willing to adopt new practices and technology, and they also have a supported technology from your SaaS tool, right? So it kind of makes sense that now we have this two-way intersection. And the last thing is this, and a lot of folks, like there's some work that needs to go in ahead of time in terms of you getting the data to make this decision, but which applications are business critical? Which apps can you tie back to revenue in your business so that you can justify, hey, here are the apps that are supported by the SaaS tool, that the teams are willing to work with me, and that they actually matter. Right? We're not scanning JSON parsers here. We're not scanning apps that are, not business critical. We're scanning things that matter and remedying vulnerabilities that would impact the organization otherwise, right? And that, to me, has been a really successful way to look at rolling out the program. And this should be obvious to us, in terms of rewarding the teams who do implement AppSec. As you consult with them in that initial engagement as the AppSec team to the dev team, maybe you do establish some goals, some baseline goals. And if you can get funding inside your own org to kind of either reward or call out those teams, it doesn't need to be huge, right? These rewards. It can even be something like swag, which has an enormous ability to influence folks, or stickers, right? So folks work towards some rewards, whether that's an intrinsic or extrinsic reward, so that you're encouraging them to reach their goal. Again, this is just influencing people here. So this is not something that is necessarily security specific. And of course, we're going to want to, throughout that consultation, throughout the program rollout, capture the data from those scans. And there's a lot of metrics out there. I know we often talk about them across our blogs. I'd encourage you to go there to talk about specific metrics. But there's a lot of data out there that you can capture, which will help you benchmark the effectiveness of your AppSec program over time. And so I'd encourage you to do that from the start if possible. Obviously, it requires a little bit of legwork. It'll slow down your program a bit, but DevOps Dojo has been really powerful for folks. It's I think that's open source. It's a low-hanging fruit. You can export all your data from GitHub and port it out into there if you don't want to use our native dashboarding tools. And also Power BI, if you're an Azure customer or if you're familiar with Power BI, pull your data via API from GitHub and port it out to these external tools. That's something that we typically see folks doing. And so there were some comments earlier in the chat here. I'm also monitoring the chat. So again, Moose and Sean, keep me honest here if I'm touching on things folks care about or not. But it can be really hard if we're trying to come in to partner with these dev teams and we're kind of walking forward with the iron fist, right? Saying, hey, you can't merge, if there's any finding from your SaaS scan, in your pull request when we perform that scan, then you're not able to merge that change back into your main branch, right? And that is frustrating for developers. That creates a ton of friction for them and for you as you're trying to roll out this program. And so I'd encourage you to start small, right? Let's go ahead and integrate your security tools in the pipeline to perform a scan on a cron job. Let's scan once a week. Let's scan once a month. If you did that across your applications, you would already be like an industry-leading organization in terms of the way you've rolled out your AppSec program. and how frequently you're scanning your applications. Start small. You're doing this cron job. Maybe your developers show up on Monday, and on Monday morning, they have the results from their scan that happened over the weekend, and then they can parse them and see what matters and what doesn't, right? And then as you up-level that program, maybe then you start to enforce some policies saying, hey, not all vulnerabilities will break your build, but only critical severity vulnerabilities that have a very high probability of impacting your organization should actually be, should be a blocking alert, if you will. So I'm going to pause there for a minute. I want to hear if there's any commentary from you again. Sean, I don't know if you're monitoring LinkedIn or the thread here. Maybe you can give us a little bit of insight.
Hey, Kev. Yeah, so I was monitoring some of the questions that were asked, and here's a couple for you from Billy Williard. Can your devs run CodeQL for dev tests and then use another tool pre-prod release?
Yeah, so they sure can. Yeah, they sure can. It would. Yeah, it's these scans are integrated in your pipeline pretty simply. We'll probably look at how to do that if we do like a technical deep dive in a later session. I'll walk you through the developer experience today, but we're not going to actually parse a pipeline and see how you can implement it. But the quick answer is yes, right? You can define when a scan is performed and which tools at the pipeline level.
Perfect.
Yeah.
There's one other question that I saw here, Kevin, and it was, I kind of know the answer, but the short answer is it is faster, but I'll let you kind of go into details on this one. It's how's performance of CodeQL comparing with other static analysis tools?
How's CodeQL's performance versus other static analysis tools? Yeah, so beauty is in the eye of the beholder, but CodeQL has a very high true positive rate. We pride ourselves on that true positive rate because, again, the developer experience is very much front and center for us. And so we don't want to produce a lot of noise at the initial integration. We don't want to erode developer trust. And so something that we focus on is, and you'll experience this if you integrate our code scanning with CodeQL, is that we have basically the way it works is we have these libraries of queries looking for specific vulnerabilities that we're running against your apps, okay? So we query your app for a vulnerability, and the initial subset of queries that we run, right, this smaller library, more specific, if you will, produces that very high true positive rate. And you can scale that out to also include things like code quality issues. So initially you look for security vulnerabilities. Maybe you also want to find code quality issues. Maybe you write your own custom queries against your apps, right, that are specific to your organization, or for some zero-day vulnerability, and you produce that, you send that back to the open source community, but want to run it yourselves. You can do that. And so, yeah, it depends which library you're using. The initial subset's very high true positive. And again, this is why I wanted to put that data in front of you early on, because we know the nature of the vulnerabilities making their ways back to your apps. We said 75% of web apps have vulnerabilities, and then we said 60 to 65% of those vulnerabilities are OWASP top 10 or SANS top 25 type vulnerabilities. And so there's a very high probability that we know the nature of that vulnerability, and we can capture it just by running the scan for those initial vulnerabilities.
Yeah, thanks, Evan. From what we've seen with customers that are using CodeQL versus the competition, is that, like I said, their performance times are definitely faster with advanced security, but at the same time, it really does depend on what type of app, the amount of lines of code, and things like that. But I would say the best way to get that answer would be to take a look at CodeQL and compare it to other tools that you might be using today.
Yeah, and again, right, the kind of the reframing that we tried to do early on here as, yes, you want effective SaaS tooling, right? You want to make sure that that tooling is producing a high true positive, low false positive rate. But what we should really be focusing on is what we do with the findings that are produced by those tools. We should be focusing on partnering with those developers and empowering those developers. And so when we're talking about that, we're talking about an integrated developer experience. So taking those security findings and putting them right into the developer workflow, right? So your developers don't have to go outside of GitHub to understand the security health of the applications they're building inside of GitHub. And so this is maybe like, you know, a segue into actually seeing the platform itself. And so some folks had asked before the session went live, and we can walk through a demo of what the developer experience will be and how we actually, you know, make this come to life. And so I want to show you, starting from a pull request, and I'm sharing now, hopefully this is an interface that's familiar for you all, but this is, you know, a GitHub repository that we have to kind of showcase what the experience will be with GitHub Advanced Security enabled and code scanning integrated, right? GitHub Advanced Security enabled and code scanning integrated. And so Isaac Cohen here has opened a pull request to suggest some change, right? He's introducing some feature back into our application. Super common, it happens every day for your developers who are delivering capabilities. And so if we've integrated, I'm just scrolling to the bottom here, if we've integrated code scanning as part of our CI pipeline, for example, we can see things like the code scanning results for each pull request that's been opened, right? And so if we define for our pipeline to run on every pull request for a specific branch to the question that was asked earlier, this is where we'll start to see that manifest. And so we can see, actually I'm gonna scroll up just to show you what the developer might find more closely is looking probably at the files changed first to say, okay, this is the contributions made by a developer. And what you'll notice is this native experience here, right? And so we as GitHub will actually comment on those files changed where a vulnerability is being introduced. Okay, and so we will show you the sources, if you will, of that vulnerability in your application. And if you want to get a little bit more context about that as a developer, inside of GitHub, you can do that by looking at the call flow, the data flow, right, in this case. And so you can see where some data was passed in and where it made its way to our backend without ever being sanitized. And so this is a SQL injection vulnerability. And so something I want to call out here is, again, your developers are very familiar with working out of this code tab, also the pull request tab, the repositories. But the security tab is really the manifestation of integrating application security into your GitHub repos, okay? And so the security tab is where they'll be spending their time as they remediate and seek to remediate vulnerabilities. And so this is the interface for a single vulnerability that your developer might come to get more insight, like, okay, you're saying there's a vulnerability, you know, from your SAST scan. Let me try to understand what that practically means for me and how I can remediate it. And so again, I could see the paths, the data flow, if you will, but I can also, as a developer, see recommendations for remediation. And again, this is all inside of GitHub, right? And so your developer is going to get that context right next to where it is that they're delivering the code itself. And so you have these recommendations to remediate vulnerabilities. And of course, you have an auditable history as these vulnerabilities, you know, as folks work on these or close them or reopen them, which you can see we've been in and out of here for some time. And so as a developer, I may want to mark this as false positive, using tests won't fix. You'll notice that fixed is not here. And that's because if the developer goes and they sanitize this input, then we will automatically in the next scan ensure that this alert is closed and no further alerts surface back in this repo. So maybe one thing, because we have a little bit of time, and I'm going to open back up for commentary from the audience, but I did want to show you secret scanning because, again, we spend so much time talking about what the experience is from the SAST perspective when we're talking about like code scanning, but secret scanning is also incredibly important. And so you can enable secret scanning at the repo level. You don't have to integrate with your pipeline. You simply go to your settings and you click enable it, just like you would for Dependabot. So definitely encourage you to go and enable Dependabot. If you're an advanced security customer, I would encourage you to consider enabling secret scanning, because out of the box, we'll automatically and perpetually perform these scans for you and surface any findings inside your security tab. I'm hesitant to scroll through those tokens because I don't know which have been like totally invalidated or not. My assumption is that they all have been. But I just want to be careful. I know all you crazy hackers are logged in here and watching over my shoulder. So that was the experience I wanted to share with you. And maybe I'll open back up again for commentary. And I would encourage you to share any commentary around like your own experience rolling out a DevSecOps program, what that means to you. And then, if you have any insight on what an integrated developer experience means practically for you and your AppSec team, please do share that, and we'll talk about it together. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen, and let's go ahead and take a look again back at some of the commentary. So I see some questions. I don't know if this was like some softball questions from folks in the audience here, because I had just talked through it and did a little bit of a demo, but I do see some people asking about, how should a security team use GitHub to partner with the app dev team to reduce the number of vulnerabilities reported? Again, I would hope that, and we'll share the content with you, but I would hope that you would take that consultative approach, right? So you have this AppSec team, you go and inject yourself into one of the sprint cycles, make sure that the engineering team has the resourcing for you. And you can talk about how to integrate CodeQL in their pipeline, whether that's in some third-party CI and GitHub Actions pipeline, and perform the first scan with them, right? Show them that it's not going to be noisy. Show them that it's a non-blocking change that you've integrated, but that will up-level the security of the applications they're delivering. And then hopefully you'll walk away having made someone a champion, but also integrated your SaaS tooling. So you're kind of achieving both goals, right? And that way you're scaling the program, and the program is scaling itself because now you've enabled a champion. So I'm just taking a look here at some of the commentary of the session. I see signs of maturity. Yeah, what are some of the signs of maturity as you're rolling out a DevSecOps program? Comments about tooling in the chat. Yeah, so again, I think a good baseline for most folks to measure themselves against, a good benchmark is just enabling those teams to perform some regular scan of their applications in the design or development phase. Okay, so let's make sure that those developers are becoming stakeholders of the security applications they're delivering. Let's make sure that the code is being regularly scanned and that we have that relationship with them, right? So we're integrating the tooling, but we're prioritizing the relationship. Again, it goes back to how do we influence the behavior of those developers to orient them towards security. Sean, I saw you dial in here. Any comments or questions that came up to you?
I was just looking at the questions and comments, and actually I just noticed one from Mohammed B. 40% of security comes before building apps, and the rest is after. That's a good point, right? I mean, and with that means that can mean a bunch of different things. For me, when I hear that, a lot of times I think of developer enablement, right? And whether that's putting the tools, more in front of the developer, or the other big piece is just learning in general, e-learning, security courses, learning about security. A lot of times developers are more developer focused than developer and security focused. And that was just a good point that, that he mentioned right there. And that's really how you enable that. And then the other thing that I did want to mention, just because, we're coming up on time, there were a lot of questions that were asked, and there were some questions about asking to see more in the GitHub platform. So if anyone out there wants to have a more one-on-one or more detailed demonstration of the GitHub platform, or just have an intimate conversation with us on GitHub Advanced Security and how we've helped folks with these issues, there is the Get Demo button towards the top right hand of the screen. So please click that and schedule some time with us.
That sounds great. Are we hanging on for a moment? Going to still drive through some of these questions, or are we kind of pointing to folks towards that next session, that follow up?
Kevin, I would say keep going. It looks like we've got a couple more minutes left here. So yeah.
Cool. I'm just looking through rules getting updated. Actually, I see Ishan Dali. I see that you asked a question around, are rules getting updated for newer languages? And I think that also implies, like, are rules being updated for new vulnerabilities, like zero-day exploits? And so that, yeah, we're going to talk a little bit more about the open source impact on GitHub's tooling generally, I think, next week. But, and Sean, I'm hearing a little bit of feedback from you, but I think, yeah, so I think something that should be called out is, like, what is the source of these CodeQL queries? what is the source of the engine behind our code scanning tool? And that is very much the open source community, right? And so if you go to, I don't know what the exact URL is. I'll look, Mr. Moose, I know you're here monitoring. So if you could drop it in the chat on Goldcast and on LinkedIn, what the repository is for the CodeQL libraries. But the open source community themselves, security researchers who are out there are producing these queries and then contributing them back to the libraries we include in the scans that you see in the tooling. And so we do curate those queries to make sure, again, they meet our standards in terms of their performance. But that is a massive source of our rules data, if you will. Another one is obviously the research team here at GitHub does a fantastic job of producing these queries, and at Microsoft. But I think it's hard to, historically, when folks start talking about like, hey, so-and-so tooling has a really well-staffed security research team, and that's how they produce all the rules and queries. And I always go back to, it's impossible to scale the power of the community, right? If you have thousands of developers producing these queries that are getting curated and published back into the tool itself, it is gonna be really difficult to resource a research organization that can keep that same velocity and quality. And so the community certainly powers the platform in that sense. So one last thing that I'll call out, because I see some thumbs up on it, and I think it's a fantastic point. I wish I could see the name, but it looks like it was posted anonymously. But in terms of reusability, we are actually, there's a roundtable happening later today where we're delivering a capability for GitHub Actions called a reusable workflow. And so the concept there is that you would be able to define a central pipeline, essentially managed pipeline that can be consumed across your organization. So imagine you, the AppSec team, develops this, starting this CodeQL integration using an actions pipeline, and make that available to the rest of the org per tech stack. So maybe you develop like this JavaScript pipeline. Hey, integrate this, and we'll automatically run code scanning for you on pull request and for all these different events. And so it's a fantastic point that you can standardize this rollout. So rather than doing it piecemeal team by team, you can also have inner source. So you're reusing that code as these centralized AppSec teams are developing them. It's highly likely that, especially for compiled languages, you'll have to do some custom build steps, but that's also dynamically injectable at runtime, right? And so you can have centralized pipelines that satisfy different tech stacks and will integrate AppSec tools. So I'd encourage you to consider that. That's a great point from the community. Thank you for that. I know we're up to time, Sean. Do we want to wrap up and look to next week?
Yeah, no. Hey, Kevin. Yeah, once again, thanks for your work this morning here. And thanks to everyone that joined. We hope to see you next week on part 2 of this learning journey. It's improving application security with an end-to-end approach. So that's going to allow us to go into even more detail with with the things that we talked about today. So look forward to speaking to you guys next week. And as I mentioned earlier, there's that Get Demo button in the top right-hand corner. If you're in Goldcast, Kevin, can you see what it is in LinkedIn? If not, you have our contact information. You can reach directly out to us if you'd like to hear more about GitHub Advanced Security.
Awesome. Thank you all very much for your time and attention. Thanks, Sean.
Thanks all.
Bye-bye.